So welcome to the McEachern Institute's second panel in the Policy Matters speaker series. Today we're talking about the report Now or Never, a call to action for Nova Scotians, commonly referred to as the Ivany Report, after the chair of the Nova Scotia Commission on Building Our New Economy, Ray Ivany. The talk falls under our Atlantic Canada and the World theme. The report identified key challenges for the province, including youth outmigration, the aging workforce, poor economic performance, increasing the size of the workforce, high dependence on government support, and limited business investment in innovation and productivity. The ONE Nova Scotia Coalition followed the report in 2014 at the request of the Government of Nova Scotia. Its mandate was to develop a 10-year plan to achieve the goals set out in the Ivany Report. The ONE dashboard is available online and tracks the 19 goals and targets set out by the Commission. The panelists today will discuss key aspects of the ONE Nova Scotia Coalition, including the Ivany Report, the implementation of policy recommendations, and the process for tracking socio-economic progress. It considers ONE Nova Scotia in light of both its historic origins and its current development in order to offer fresh perspectives on provincial governance and policy formulation. I will briefly introduce each panelist before they speak. Each panelist will be given 9 to 10 minutes to make their presentations. This shorter presentation is deliberate, of course, on our part, because we'd like to create as much opportunity to have discussions at the end of the panel, so there'll be a rich Q&A. I will make the note that Dr. Jerry Bannister and Dr. Karen Foster will be leaving at 1:20, and so when we get to questions, just keep in mind that they will only be here until 1:20. We'll probably go past 1:20, so if you have questions for them, you might want to get those out early. Our first speaker is Dr. Rick Williams. He's the sole proprietor of Praxis Research and Consulting Incorporated. He currently leads a federally funded research project on labor supply challenges for seasonal industries in Canada. Dr. Williams served as Deputy Minister for Policy and Priorities in the Government of Nova Scotia and was the government lead in establishing and supporting the ONE Nova Scotia Commission. Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. I was saying to Kevin, I stopped working in the government in December of 2013, and the Ivany Report came in a few months later, and this is the first opportunity I've had to speak in public about that experience of working on that. So I have a lot of pent-up kind of stuff to say. Just a footnote, Danny, to your very, very eloquent comments on Alan McEachern. You referenced that being Minister of Finance was not his greatest success. But for any of you who are students of fiscal policy, go back and look at his, I won't know the year, right, but his first, I believe it was his first budget. I would characterize it as the most radically progressive budget in Canadian history. His timing was probably not great, but it was quite a significant change in policy direction at the time. Do I have, yeah, I'm here. All right, so Kevin has asked me to start off by just providing some background on how the ONE Nova Scotia Commission came to be, and how it evolved out of the work in the government and the policy evolution in the government. So I'm going to give you that background, and I'll leave it to others to evaluate what's happened since in terms of the reports, how the report's been used or followed. Although I will end with a couple of comments on where I think the province is now relative to the situation in 2011-12 when the commission was initiated. So what were the origins of the report on the ONE Nova Scotia Commission? Again, students of the government, if you can find it, because I understand it's no longer available on the government webpage, go back to the 2009, November 2009 report of the Premier's Economic Advisors Panel. The new government, the new NDP government came in June of 2009. The first thing that many new governments do is kind of, open the books and let's look at the true state of the province or the fiscal state of the government. And so a panel was chaired by Donnell Savoie with Elizabeth Beale from APEC, Lars Osberg from here at Dal, and Tim O'Neill. prominent economist and bank economist, had a, there was a Deloitte kind of opening the books accounting exercise, and then this panel was asked to provide the government with advice on what to, where to go with the results of, what appeared to be the true state of fiscal condition of the government. So they provided this report in October, November of 2009, and it really lays the foundations for everything we're going to talk about since, because it identified the core themes in all of this. So it identified a looming 1.4. If the province continued on the track that it was on in terms of revenues and expenditures, and the economic pattern of economic growth, we were headed towards a $1.4 billion current account deficit by 2014, and it was largely a structural deficit. It wasn't just a matter of, an up or a down in the cycle. It was a built-in greater expenditure relative to revenue. And what the panel, the advisory committee kind of called for was, we called it the three-legged stool, that it wouldn't work unless you did all three things with equal intensity. So yes, you had to have greater spending discipline. You had to restrict particularly wage and salary growth across the government, or not restrict it, but slow it down. Secondly, you had to look at some revenue, some taxation increases, some movements on the revenue side in order to tackle this looming deficit. And in particular, they recommended picking up the two points in the HST that the federal government had given up. But their strongest point of emphasis was that those measures, if you tried to solve this structural deficit purely on the taxation and spending side, you're just going to be caught in a loop. It was just a vicious cycle. So unless you did something to bring the province out of its long-term economic pattern of slow growth, you were never going to escape this cycle. So they emphasized very strongly emphasis on economic development. So I think that's where this whole conversation starts. Where does the government of Nova Scotia come in on economic development? Now, at the time, Donald Savoie advised the Premier and the people around him very emphatically. His kind of mantra was that, okay, this is going to take some, increased taxation, cuts in program spending, salary restraint. This is going to take some sacrifice, some pain. You cannot ask the public or your employees to make sacrifices to solve a problem that they don't know they have. And I'd like you to keep that thought in mind, right? It's one thing to, tackle a problem that everybody wants to have solved, but if there isn't that level of understanding or acceptance of the need to tackle that problem, it's going to be tough. So from there, we move into, that was in the fall of 2009. As we move into 10 and into 11, the government had adopted that outlook, and I think was very comfortable with that outlook that the economy was the core policy focus. There were a lot of, healthcare was obviously another kind of dominant concern, but if we didn't get the economy going, these other issues were going to be very difficult to deal with. In October of 2011, Irving won the ships contract. And that was, we were looking at a $25 billion contract over, with thousands of jobs and so on in Halifax. And at that point, again, Savoie was working with us on another issue on regional development authorities. And again, his very pointed advice to the Premier was that Halifax is okay. Halifax is going to do fine for the next 25 years. Your problem is the rest of the province. And you've got to, politically, in order to try to stay in government, but also from a point of view of good public policy, good governance, you've got to start doing something about the rest of the province. And that was very, very pointed advice that came in from somebody that we listened to very carefully. At the same time, the government was finding increasingly that its emphasis on economic growth, economic development, particularly summed up in the Jobs Here strategy or policy framework, was not winning, was not turning out to be politically a winning approach. There was a lack of public consensus, it seemed, on the need for bold action on the economy. And the Jobs Here strategy that emphasized a whole range of different approaches to growing the economy was not really getting the political bounce that we were looking for. And in particular, it wasn't seen as relevant to the rural economy. And then in the fall and winter of 2011-12, we lost 3 pulp mills. And that really meant 3 communities in crisis. The Port Hawkesbury mill, the Stora mill at Port Hawkesbury, Liverpool, and Hansford. And again, the government's very aggressive, active response to try to save some of those mills and save those communities did not get the kind of positive political response that the government was expecting. And so on. It turned out to be very controversial. And so there seemed to be, by the time we got into late 2012, abundant evidence that, going back to Savoy's advice, that the public doesn't understand and didn't understand the economic, fiscal, and demographic sustainability challenges that the province faced. And there wasn't political public support for taking the risks that would be needed. So then Ray Ivany came in to the story. Ray agreed to lead this commission that the Premier had decided as a response to this situation. And he brought his own particular approach. First of all, we had started out thinking on Savoy's advice about a rural development strategy, but Ray insisted on one economy. He had a notion of Nova Scotia being a city-state, a jurisdiction or a province that was increasingly organized around a core metropolitan region. So he insisted on a ONE Nova Scotia approach. He insisted on taking the time to do it right, and that meant extending beyond the government's mandate at the time. So the report would not come in until after the election. Arm's length and wholly independent, and commission members with impeccable credentials. The goals of the commission, as he set them out and as were agreed by the government, were to do new research, build some new knowledge, but also put a lot of energy into challenging some ideas, notions that, if it's good for Halifax, it's bad for Cape Breton, a whole lot of standard Nova Scotia ideas, I guess, and build a new fact base. Share as much information as possible, be as transparent as possible so people could understand why we needed to solve these problems. Time is up. And then all of it leading to policy advice. I'll skip over the major themes. You've all read it, I'm sure. But it tried to establish a very positive note that we really could turn this province around with concerted action, but it would take concerted action. There are major opportunities. The growth of Halifax, the aligning Nova Scotia with globalization could work for us in the way it did in pre-Confederation times, leveraging a highly developed post-secondary education system, renewable energy, excellence in tourism and cultural sectors. So there were real major opportunities to turn things around. I'll skip my example of the fishing industry, but a traditional industry that a lot of people have written off was booming. It's now the leading export sector in the province. Identified game changers, a number of things that would have to change, and among them being the kind of political culture, the highly partisan kind of approach on these issues. Ivany is very passionate about, and still is, I think, about, this is a crisis. Everybody needs to get on the same page. Even if you have different ideas about what to do, it's going to take a shared approach. Basic question, did the report exaggerate? I think this is a really important maybe thing we can discuss today. Is there really a crisis in the province? And I think my heading for my talk was, ONE Nova Scotia really? Or, ONE Nova Scotia, yeah, right? There's really 2 Nova Scotias. People who are living the crisis and their communities are in crisis and so on. And then there's the Halifax region, where I think it's quite insulated. And my closing comment was, that was in 2011 that we set out, to respond to the demographic economic crisis. Where are we today? I just picked up a few recent statistics from the 2016 census, but also a report just out from the Fraser Institute saying that of 50 American states and 10 provinces in Canada, Nova Scotia ranked 57th in total employment growth between 2014 and 2016 since the report. And private sector employment growth, we ranked 58th, and we're losing ground. And on average output per worker, we ranked 59th. So I'll stop there.
On that cheery note, I'd like to ask Danny Graham to come to the podium. Danny Graham was the former leader of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party and MLA for Halifax Citadel. He is currently the Chief Engagement Officer for Engage Nova Scotia. Mr. Graham has been on boards and commissions of many organizations, including the ONE Nova Scotia Coalition, which wrote, We Choose Now, a playbook for Nova Scotia.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to begin just by acknowledging something that I think Rick modestly went past in the process of this. The Ivany Commission is now sort of, for anybody related to public policy in Nova Scotia, iconically associated with Ray, Ivany, and Ray would be, as another humble Cape Bretoner, the first person to say that that's rather overdone. He would rather not have the kind of attention that has been associated with his name for this particular work, but there's really no turning back from the place that we're at right now, and it will forever be known as the Ivany Report. Even the ONE Nova Scotia Coalition report that I was a part of, that Ray was not at all a part of, got rolled into this. But more to the point, this initiative that I think woke Nova Scotians up in a way that they hadn't been awakened at any other time began under the leadership of Premier Dexter and his team, his staff. And of the people who he assigned to get the work done and to put the report together, Rick Williams was by far the most important person to make that happen. So the exercise of putting the framework around this and understanding how this needs to move forward has Rick Williams' fingerprints all over it, and I think too rarely has he been recognized for the incredible service that he's done for the people of Nova Scotia. As you heard from him, it started with the Savoie report. Not many people talk about that. The Ivany report was really the wake-up call. It was February of 3.5 years ago. 3.5 years ago, February. That down by Pier 21, Ray and the other commissioners gathered. Some of you might have been present at the time. And I remember beforehand Ray saying that this is going to be about a 2-week wonder. There won't be many legs that sort of flow from this. He could not have imagined that this report would have sort of stuck in the consciousness of dialogue in Nova Scotia the way that it has. It was followed by the ONE NS Coalition work. I like to describe the difference between those. One was the diagnosis, provided a diagnosis with its 19 goals and its 12 or so game changers. And then a report was prepared called the Playbook, and it, in a 7-chapter writing, spoke about the prescription, if you will, of what might be possible in those areas. Each report has, I think, tremendous merit. The approach that they've taken were somewhat different in the way that they were written, but the principles that sort of anchored them, I would suggest, was the same. The things that distinguished, we in Nova Scotia have been writing reports about the future of the province since the 1930s. And every one of them, until this report, spoke about the need for us, the urgent need for us to pay attention to our economic woes and our population challenges. This report, however, was arrived with Nova Scotians in an entirely different way. And I'd like to share with you just a few things that I think made it different. One was that it was written in a particularly candid kind of way. as Maritimers, we know that if you call somebody out and you're not right, you might get bet up. But if you call somebody out, including ourselves, and you're right, people recognize the truth, and they will support and protect the truth. And the candid way that this called us all to be accountable, not just public leaders, but everyone to be accountable for our future, I think set this apart. It was written in plain language. And it was written, again, not just to government, but to all Nova Scotians, and said that this isn't a responsibility for just a few people. This is a responsibility for everyone to dive into. Thirdly, it was delivered fundamentally by Ray. And for anyone who knows Ray Ivany, you'd appreciate the level of integrity that he carries to the work that he would plainly say is never always right, but you know that it comes from a place of him believing deeply and for the right reasons in the future of our province. And lastly, here's the thing that I think deserves the greatest amount of attention, and it's resulted in me doing much of the work that I do right today. As Kevin said, I'm with an organization called Engage Nova Scotia. We actually started before the Ivany Commission came about. It was just a ragtag group of passionate amateurs stuck together with duct tape and chicken wire trying to sort of aspire to a better Nova Scotia. And along comes the Ivany Commission that I think put some boosters under the work that we were doing. And the boosters came in the third area of thinking around this report. The Ivany Commission report didn't just talk about our economic and demographic challenges. It talked about our culture and our attitude. It said that the psychological barriers of distrust, division, and discouragement are just as important as raising new capital or finding new investments. And that was a fundamental shift in the way that we started to see each other. It so happened that this was anchored more deeply in the coalition work, where it said these are the three main pillars of what we need to be talking about: the economy, demography, and what they called attitude or culture. And that third area is related to the work that we at Engage Nova Scotia want to do. And I just want to touch on what that is and its relevance to that third leg, and then just make a quick comment on how I think we're doing. So our aspiration is to, at Engage, is to make sure that more Nova Scotians understand our opportunities, our advantages, and the hurdles in front of us. And that more people are stepping up to improve our economy and the quality of life in this province. And thirdly, that if they're going to do that, they are more collaborative, inclusive, and adaptive to change. That could sound fuzzy to some people. But it's squarely anchored in those two reports, and it's squarely anchored, I think, in our understanding of how we as Nova Scotians have been an obstacle to the future that we want to have for each other. So the kinds of work that we do could be one of the most visible things that we do is host and coordinate Share Thanksgiving, which I would encourage everyone, whether you are a long-standing Nova Scotian or a newcomer to Nova Scotia, to sign up for this year. It involves Nova Scotians opening their doors to newcomers to have a Thanksgiving meal with them so that people sink their roots into this province and stay for longer periods of time. More I could say on that, but I'll try to respect the time. A second pillar of the work that we are doing relates to the notion of public engagement. We believe that the trust vertically between government and citizens has been declining, lots of data to support that, but also in this time of social media, laterally between sectors, we're all falling into our echo chambers of truth. And our ability to trust each other and to work collaboratively, laterally together has declined substantially. So how do we go about fixing that? Well, tomorrow, for example, our organization will be working with 4 municipalities in the Annapolis Valley, helping to strengthen their understanding of, commitment to, and tools with engaging the public in a way that they welcome them into the future of their region of the province. And finally, one of the things that we're really excited about is the establishment of Canada's first province-wide index and survey on quality of life. This idea of GPI Atlantic that some of you would be familiar with, that Ron Coleman pioneered in this region, is something that, it's an idea that has come. And when we talked to Ray after the report about, in addition to the economic and demographic issues, we may have an advantage here in Nova Scotia that we haven't paid enough attention to for a long period of time, and it's called our quality of life. So if we treasure it, let's measure it. And let's make sure that we as a province are starting to put our shoulder to the wheel on the things that will really make a difference to people's lives. We asked 1,000 Nova Scotians on a scale of 1 to 10, 2 questions. Success should be measured by growing our economy. We got a strong response. Success should be measured on improving our quality of life across every demographic, every geographic region of this province. Quality of life is a substantial and higher measure for them of success. So, we're excited about the work that we're doing. We think that it relates directly to the ONE-NS aspirations. If I were to give a snapshot of what I think about how we're doing, it would essentially be that the jury's out. This is a 10-year project that we're being asked for. And what I'm most encouraged with, as I think about the Creative Destruction Lab last night, the ways that the ocean sector and universities are collaborating, that there is, it appears, a greater willingness for people to work effectively across sectors to make things happen in a way that I feel that we haven't done at any time in our previous history. There are some indicators on a dashboard that has been created that suggests that some things are moving in the right direction and other things aren't. Again, the jury is out. I have more comments about what of the goals, whether the goals are arbitrary somewhat or whether they're real, but they're important nonetheless. Thanks very much.
Jerry Bannister is an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie University and coordinator of the Canadian Studies program. He's an award-winning historian with research topics that include energy projects and regional politics in Atlantic Canada. He has served on the boards of several national organizations and is a past chair of the editorial board of the Canadian Historical Review. He's also a member of the McEachern Institute's Research Committee. Jerry.
Thank you. Just a footnote for Kevin is that I've got a class I've got to be to at 1:30. It's Halifax in the World, so I've got to run. I've got 200 people waiting for me at 1:30. And part of what we talk about, it's what's so fascinating, talking about these things as a researcher. I'm going to run over at 1:30 and then put on my teacher's hat. They're all the same issues, and which I think is fascinating. So I'm here really in some ways as an insider, as a longtime professor here at Dal, coordinator of the Canadian Studies program, and as Kevin said, a member of the research committee of the McEachern Institute, but also really an outsider. So for me, this is a new research project, and I am an historian. And what I'm committed to, and what I've been involved with, is looking at things like the McEachern Institute and other policy documents, looking at the role of history and memory. So my take on the Ivany Report and why my interest in it, and one of the things I want to persuade you of today, the Ivany Report has all sorts of things, statistics, ideas, passion, all that stuff that we've heard described so eloquently. But it has a story. And I think when we engage with Engage Nova Scotia, and when we talk about these ideas, we need to be doing more, I think, to be aware of the narrative, the history, and the memory. And like all memory, it's selective. And one of the things I want to emphasize at the outset, it's really easy. I was involved, the other way I should point out that I'm an outsider is I'm a Newfoundlander. So everyone has come up here so far and talked about where they're from, Cape Breton. Well, Newfoundlanders have a very interesting relationship, let us say, between politics, partisanship, and memory as well. And I think that gives me both some advantages and maybe as an outsider, there's some things that I should learn. But I was involved in Newfoundland, went through a very similar process at the turn of the 21st century. We established a royal commission. We went a different route, but very similar process. And I was involved and I was tasked with writing up the historical assessment, kind of summarizing Newfoundland history for our 2003 Royal Commission, which reported just before Danny Williams came to power and oil shot up. And one of the things I learned from that is very, very easy to be critical and dismissive of these kinds of efforts. And so one of the things I want to emphasize at the outset before I get into some of my initial theories and findings is that what I'm going to offer is not a knee-jerk reaction or critique. It's just whenever you write these documents, of course they're going to be making all sorts of generalizations. Of course it's aspirational. Taking these kind of documents and criticizing them, I've seen a lot of the comments both on social media and in scholarship, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's easy and it's lazy scholarship. What I'm interested in doing is talking about trying to understand the patterns in the Ivany Report, what it reflects about the culture, what it reflects about the process, and what it reflects about where we are and where we're going to be moving forward. Because I think it's in memory and selection. And the fascinating work in behavioral economics and social psychology would tell you stories are what matters. That's what animates people. That's what animates, I don't care what your data set is, in the end you're going to be telling a story and people want to hear a story. And if they're not hearing a story, they're going to construct a story. And I think that's where I want to come. So I'm focusing especially on Chapter 3. It's about pages 12 to 35 in the Ivany Report, which provides that bedrock. You know, all the things that we talk about, and you heard this with our two eloquent speakers, it's compared to what? Compared to the past, compared to the future, compared to another place. You know, any claim, if it's going to be reasonable and compelling, has to be based on some kind of comparator. And I don't know if I've got a PowerPoint up here, or I had one here. I'll just kind of walk through some of the... So in terms of the comparisons and the ways in which these play out in the Ivany Report, there we go.
There you go.
Thank you.
That way or
Excellent. So I'm going to talk a little bit. We only have 10 or 11 minutes. I'm happy to do follow-up either on email or in the roundtable afterwards. Talk about the periodization a little bit, the topics and themes, the generalizations, that the Ivany Report is a work of history. There's obviously quite a bit of historical research went into it. And it's selective. And the patterns I want to look at in terms of inclusion, what the Ivany Report talks about. So they've got a historical section which makes claims, quite strong claims about Nova Scotia's history, and what it excludes. And again, I'm not trying to be dismissive or critical. I just want to observe that. And then I want to talk about what I think is the historical mindset, the perspective. And the argument, because I may run out of time, you only have 10 minutes, is that I think there is some really key, the word, I'm trying to use a neutral word, is tensions. What's remarkable about the Ivany Report, it's really broad. I mean, it's broader than what we did in Newfoundland in 2003 when we reported on the Royal Commission, which was reconsidering our place in Canada. Should Newfoundland separate? That was one of the things we tested. And the ONE Nova Scotia, if anything, was even broader in its mandate and broader in its perspective. And yet the tension is the narrowness of some of the vision and the evidentiary basis. So it's about economy and demography. So I think, and again, I don't mean to be critical, but when you have that set up and you're talking about the future of an entire province, you're talking about policy, what are we going to do, what are we not going to do, we need to keep in mind that the evidentiary basis and the focus and the framework is based on some really narrow and specific things. And I think there's a tension there that either needs to be resolved or at least we need to be aware of it. One of the other tensions, and I think we heard it, or in one of the other issues, I just find it's an issue or maybe a development, is the fascinating relationship in the Ivany Report, and I don't know, I can't really think of another example, between policy and politics. You know, so the Ivany Report is something that talks so much about policy and politics, and yet if you go through that historical section, which I did fairly carefully, it's history drained of politics, right? I think that's interesting. You're not going to find Joe Howe, you're not going to find Alan J. McEachern, and I think it's, and again, as an outsider, I presume it was a deliberate choice, so it's history focusing on economics, on policy, the national policy is there, but it doesn't talk about Sir John A. Macdonald, so it has a very particular focus. So what we're getting is a kind of a broad conception of memory and history, emphasizing very much the historical perspective, but politics, and as we heard from our previous commentators, the partisanship and party politics, that I think we have an issue there in terms of how politics fits in with ONE Nova Scotia, how electoral politics fits in, and I think that's something where there's a need for a lot more dialogue in terms of how that's going to work out. So the narrative. And I think I put up declensionist, there's a question of what kind of narrative it is. The story of the Ivany Report, if you read through it, and it is a story, and it's well written, by the way. I mean, it's written at a grade 8 or grade 9 level. And it is, in some ways, there's again, another kind of tension there between what's called a declensionist narrative, which are lots of narratives, and again, those neighboring provinces and countries talk about this narrative of decline, of challenges, of one of the words that I really peaked or tweaked to when I was reading it, and again, preparing last night, is missed opportunities. There are key words. It uses, the words "we're on the brink," right? Crisis is used. I should go through and quantify, but crisis is used repeated. So it's declensionist, but it's also in terms of a narrative of redemption. Right? It's a narrative of hope. And though the coexistence of those two narratives, in terms of missed opportunities, of a story of decline, with a story of almost an existential. I mean, again, keep in mind that the stakes could not be higher. The language which is written is essentially existential, kind of sets up a tremendous kind of weight that this narrative has to bear. You know, there's a lot that has to ride on this very short 20-page section in the paper. So it's they talk about the pre-Confederation era up to 1879, manufacturing and heavy industry, which gets a lot of emphasis. The rural economy, which I thought was very interesting, talking about what typically historians would call it the Depression, but it gets termed as the rural economy and the kind of contraction. And then I think, interestingly, we talk about the government-led economy. Now, semantics, as any linguist could tell you, semantics are important, right? Language is important. It's the government-led economy. It's not the politics-led economy or the politician-led economy or the liberal-led economy. It's the idea of the role of government and the appropriate role of government. I think what the Ivany Report is doing is making us, and as our previous speakers talked about, making us think about that as an issue, but you need to be careful that having the solution almost be in front of you before you get through that issue. Because there's an awful lot of things the government was doing that time in the government-led economy. You could argue it's a government-followed economy. If you look at the demands that the population had throughout this period, a lot of ways the governments are responding as much as they are leading. And I think that's important as well. So in terms of some of the things that's in, what's emphasized, and again, I'm not doing this to be critical or dismissive, but just a kind of broad overview, economy, industry, business, none of these things are surprises. And entrepreneurs and governments, but not politics. And what gets omitted? And again, Indigenous peoples are there in other places within the report, but it is important that in the history section, Indigenous peoples are not there. Labor movements and cooperative movements. The anti-Ganesh movement is arguably one of the most popular things I teach. When I teach the anti-Ganesh movement, you can hear a pin drop. And yet, interestingly enough, in terms of this perspective, it's something which is not emphasized. And again, I don't mean to be critical, but I think we need to think about the things that we're missing, the parts of the conversation that we're not having. And I think I'm right on time. Good. I got 1 minute left. Excellent. So where are we? So I think, and again, it's just understanding the Ivany Report and understanding it in terms of history and memory, not being, engaging with engage, is the way I would put it. We have crises without critics. For a document which is so well written and so powerful, there are no villains. Right? And which is good in a way. It means that we can have a safe conversation. My worry as a historian, that leaves out responsibility, it leaves out the political aspects, it leaves out real, and again, in terms of regional politics and some of the things going on, that we really need to be aware of, there's always someone making the decisions. And if we're going to talk about responsibility, we need to talk about it. Maybe we do need to name names. If we're going to talk about the problems that we have, and the word that I use is vices and villains, there is an issue then. It's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to have that conversation without having a real discussion about responsibility. Problems without politicians, and then progress without politics. And I think that's the real challenge with ONE Nova Scotia, to do this in a way which runs concurrent with our parliamentary electoral system, and in the ways in which those two things interact or don't interact. I think we need to be aware of the selectivity of that history. The final point, and this is the point I'll leave with, are these competing narratives. The declensionist narrative and the narrative of redemption. Right? The story that it tells. The story which it tells based on this kind of broad vision of what Nova Scotia could be, based on a kind of a narrow, selective vision of its economy, demography, and this question, which I think we need to, rather than taking as a presumption, is the question of how we define that crisis. You know, what is the turning point? So rather than taking that as the first, you know, our axiom, my take of this as a historian is to understand what we mean, what we define as crisis historically. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Karen Foster holds the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. Her CRC research focuses on how government policy, global markets, and local everyday life intersect. Dr. Foster's most recent book, Productivity and Prosperity, challenges the notion that increasing productivity is the best or only way to guarantee prosperity to ordinary people.
Thank you. I don't have a slideshow, so I don't know if I can just get rid of that. Okay. Thanks everyone for welcoming me here today, and the rest of the panelists. On the one hand, this is an awkward premise. I've been invited to reflect on a report and a coalition on a panel that includes a coalition member and one of the report's key movers. On the other hand, I think it speaks to a healthy intellectual community that prioritizes and supports the free, respectful expression and exchange of ideas. Plus, my response to the ONE Coalition and the Ivany Report is the same response that I have to most discourse about economic development in Nova Scotia and the rest of the Atlantic region, and actually the world. The coalition and report just happened to be, in this instance, a lightning rod for critique of much wider economic development and political discourse that deserve to be questioned by bright minds like yours. So I am going to be critical. I think that's what I'm here to do today. I probably couldn't do the task of governing, but I am able to critique it, and I think that's kind of the point of this academic and policy interchange. So I'm going to focus on three targeted critiques that I tried to seed with the readings that I suggested to the class. The first critique is a basic sociological critique, and it's that the report and the coalition documents tend to individualize social problems. So that is, as C. Wright Mills would put it, they confuse the personal troubles of milieu with the public issues of social structure. The report does this in its repeated emphasis on attitudes. Coming at this as a sociologist, the focus on attitudes and attitudes about economic development in particular grated me more than anything. I am so glad that the ONE dashboard doesn't measure progress on attitude change, and I think that on that one it deserves praise. But the report was so unequivocal about the primacy of attitudes to the point that I am surprised that the coalition doesn't have an attitude meter. So, for example, from the report, they point to the lack of shared vision and commitment to economic growth and renewal as the single most significant impediment to change and renewal. We do not, as a province, share broad agreement on the need for economic growth. Virtually everyone sees the need for population growth and greater wealth generation, but the practical strategies to achieve these are controversial. It points to a, quote, lack of solidarity as a province, saying that this undermines constructive dialogue about our future and makes us a more difficult and risk-averse place to do business and build communities. So I'll offer just a few disconnected thoughts on these claims from a sociological perspective. So the first thought is that attitudes come from somewhere. People's attitudes, like their behaviors, beliefs, and values, do not just arise willy-nilly. When I read the Ivany Report, though, what I see is what a sociologist might call a vulgar functionalist rendering of society, where our economic stagnation is blamed on our inability to play our respective roles, so mainly as workers and communities that are open for business, and accept the dominant ideology and economic order. I don't buy that rendering of society. It's too simplistic, it doesn't acknowledge power and inequality, and the validity of people's situated understandings of the world and economies around them. That's not to say that there aren't good and bad attitudes and that there aren't reasons to think about people's attitudes and attitude change. It is just to say that it's not as simple as telling people that what they think is wrong. From a sociological perspective, the emphasis on the need for consensus and shared broad agreements is problematic because social change is probably always, at some level, the product of conflict between different ideas, values, and goals. And so imagining that a consensus will emerge and we'll all march toward a brighter future is unlikely. Whatever happens in Nova Scotia will be, at least in part, the result of one worldview edging out another, which will not die, but will reorganize and reconstitute into something partly new. So relatedly, it's perplexing to see both sides of divisive issues in the report presented, followed by the conclusion that the disagreement itself constitutes a barrier to progress. So for example, there's a passage about resource extraction, extractive industries in rural economies. It says that some participants emphasized the need to renew, modernize, and in some cases expand these traditional sectors, while others described them as sunset industries or felt that there was too little room to develop them without unacceptable damage to ecosystems. There is no follow-up discussion about what we should do, just that the two sides must come together and, I presume, reach a consensus. But on what? What would a consensus between two seemingly irreconcilable views look like? Is it not a government's job to lead toward one or the other with a clear vision? Unless I'm missing something, the commission or the report essentially say to groups they believe are diametrically opposed, you figure out and then we'll do what you want. So there is then an avoidance of ethical questions. The problem is that you can't eliminate or sidestep ethical questions. You always end up taking a side. And in this case, the side, I fear, is with whatever grows the economy and makes us more competitive, because it is in the interests of powerful people and groups to do things that grow the economy and adhere to notions of competitiveness. This leads me to a second critique. The second is that the report and the coalition both assume, that is, they take for granted, that economic growth in the form of productivity growth and export development is necessary, and that it improves living standards and life in general. And yet, economies do not need to grow consistently and at a high rate in order to work well and to deliver reasonable standards of living to their inhabitants. In fact, if you make a chart showing productivity growth over the last century and map that alongside gains or a chart of median wages, you'll see that after rising together for decades, the two parted ways, and productivity has continually increased while wages have slowed and even stagnated. So the link between economic growth and prosperity is not a scientific fact. I'm happy to see Engage Nova Scotia is prioritizing the quality of life survey and the emphasis on quality of life. There is a spectrum of theory and belief on this matter, on this question of economic growth, but governments almost always prioritize growth above a range of other equally important things. It's virtually impossible in the present political discourse to say, maybe we don't need to grow the economy. It's heretical, but it is valid. It's a valid question. We have to question the assumption that economic growth is necessary. And at the very least, this discursive wiggle room would allow us to be growth agnostic, which means refusing to let economic growth be the deciding factor in policy development and governance decisions. A more specific problem is the emphasis in the report and throughout our political discourse on export-led growth. So even if we cede the matter of economic growth and say, okay, we want the economy to grow, there is more than one way to grow an economy. The most straightforward way is to bring in new money, and the strategy we reach for first to bring in new money is to sell more exports. However, it's not exports per se that are the most important to the health of a local economy, but the local trade balance. The total value of exports minus the value of imports. So greater exports can improve a trade balance, but so too can fewer imports. And reducing imports delivers additional benefits, can make communities, regions, and provinces and entire countries more self-reliant and insulate them from the uncontrollable and unpredictable economic shocks that dog international markets. A key problem with the Ivany Report, if we accept these critiques, is that its goals revolve almost entirely around an export-led growth model. So there's little concern about local control over local economic development. That might be why there's not much talk about cooperatives. There's little concern with meeting local demand with local production. And this is especially problematic in a place like Nova Scotia that has, for over a century, been the poor dog wagged by the tail of the global marketplace, and to what ends. I don't mean that we need to stop exporting or caring about exports altogether, but we need to even just for an intellectual exercise, flip our priorities and think about ways to meet local demand for products and services with local production. That's easier said than done, of course, but saying it is one step toward doing it. A third related critique mirrors the second. The report and the coalition assume, that is, they take for granted the notion of competitiveness. Competitiveness, like the need for growth and export-led growth in particular, is an assumption. It's a hegemonic discourse, as Gillian Bristow puts it, and it's allowed to be used in policy development without explanation. It doesn't need to be theorized or argued for. It can be assumed a priori or in advance. So it's like gravity or the boiling point of water, except without any of the scientific certainty. The Ivany Report wields the notion of competitiveness haphazardly, and I get the impression that this reflects either an attempt to reconcile differences of view among the many actors involved in the report's production, or a lack of reflection on one of the report's central concepts. So to wit, throughout, there is a tension between cooperation and competitiveness at the level of firms, industries, regions, and economies. But I get the message, only cooperation, not competition, among local communities themselves. So why is this a problem? If being competitive is used as a justification for all manner of policies and actions, we ought to know what it means and whether or not it's a legitimate goal. Bristow's point is that we don't really know what it means, and it probably isn't a legitimate goal. Does being more competitive make us a better society? Does it make life better? Does it make some people very rich and subject others to unstable work at insufficient wages in markets where the cost of living rises faster than most incomes? It depends on the definition of competitiveness, and yet few in policy circles are explicit about their definition or whether it's justified by any evidence. I think this is an extremely concerning point in our context, and I've chosen attitudes, growth, and competitiveness, but there are a number of concepts in the report that deserve scrutiny in the spirit of clarifying where it is that we want to go, with whose interests in mind, and how we can get there. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thanks so much to the panelists for a very thoughtful start to our panel today. I'm inclined to give Rick and Danny a minute to respond before we go to questions, just because some of the issues that were raised by the Jerry and Karen, I think, have made us think about the positions you put forward. So I'm going to give you each a minute, and I'll start with Rick. If you'd like to start us off, if you want to offer some initial thoughts before we take questions. You have the right to pass, Rick, but I'm sure you won't. But
yeah, it's awkward in the sense that, you know, I wasn't a commissioner. I'm not the commission. I can't speak for what Ray, Ivany, or the commission itself would say. So I'm an observer like everybody else, although obviously was involved in setting this thing up and setting it in motion. But I guess where all that takes me is that this kind of an academic discourse is something that can happen in a bubble where you don't have to make real decisions and deal with the situations of real people. I think the report, I don't want to get drawn into a detailed thing, but as I understood it, the reason for the historical chapter in the report was not to write a definitive history of Nova Scotia, but was to talk about, it's an economic history, it's to talk about the structure of the economy and how it's evolved. I know Ray Ivany I've heard him speak on this. He's very passionate about the idea that our history is not our destiny, right? And to understand that we've been in different situations at different times as the global economy has evolved and changed, and we could be in a different place in a different time ahead if different things happen. So he's trying to break out of a kind of a fatalistic kind of notion that we're just, for one reason or another, destined to be a marginal, economically backward place. And out of that comes a kind of a theory about, because of our small market, because of the makeup of our economy around resources and primary production and so on, we could make globalization work for us better than some other places could. We do have there's a comparative advantage there that we should pursue and not overlook the kind of value of those traditional sectors. So, he was making an argument. He wasn't really trying to do a definitive history. So,
Rick, can I shift to Danny?
Pardon me?
May I shift to Danny now?
Yeah, sure.
I'm mindful of our time, so Danny, you got to take a minute?
I'm going to give you bullets because this is really interesting. Darrell and I ran in an election in 2003 where one of the ballot issues was auto insurance. And while it was important to some people, consider that in the context of Mr. Bannister's questions about, are we asking the big questions about who are we, what are we after, and how do we get there? I couldn't agree more. With respect, I'll deal with the second and first items that Dr. Foster had put forward. Agree completely. Never in our time have the assumptions about economic growth been called into question by people. The UK is currently including prostitution, the drug trade, and the black market in their measurements of GDP. That graph that broke off in the 1970s around productivity and the mean wage, 100% that's really clear. On the first point that Dr. Foster made, that's a really interesting one, and it sounds more personal. So we did some research on that, and we asked Nova Scotians, are you willing to change? Do you feel informed about the issues? And do you feel able to be part of the change? And there were very different answers. Actually, Nova Scotians self-described themselves to be quite willing to change, contrary to perhaps some assumptions that people have about the attitude issue. What they don't feel, according to our research, is that they can be able to be part of the change, which is why we're doing some of the work. I do suggest, we do have some research on whether Nova Scotians feel unified in our efforts, and actually they self-describe as feeling not very unified. In some regions, like Cape Breton, feel more alienated than other parts of the province. So lots to chew on in this creating a balance.
Okay, thank you. I should mention that I've asked 5 students to prepare questions for today. And if we have more time, we'll go beyond the 5. I do want to ask, though, among the 5, if someone would like to direct a question specifically to Karen or Jerry. Please go ahead. And start by introducing yourself, please.
I'm Ivany Report, I'm an MPA candidate.
Oh, I'm sorry. You need to speak into the microphone. That's right. pardon me.
Hi,
An enhancement.
I'm
is sweet.
an MPA candidate. My question's for Jerry, and it's more about, you said the lack of history with politics within the economic development of Nova Scotia. How do you bring them into that now with regard to the Ivany Report?
I mean, it's a really good question, and again, and your point is well taken as well. I mean, it's not. It's part of the these tensions. Whenever you do these things, that's part of the humbling experience that I had being involved in a royal commission. No matter what you do, you make choices, and those choices involve selection. You can't do everything. If you do everything, you're never going to get done. But these things are always done either implicitly or explicitly in historical context and in terms of the selections of memory. And I think that those things are going to be there or not, and they're there in terms of the justification, they're there in terms of the evidence, and they're there in terms of the comparators. So each one of these things. Where I'm from, Nova Scotia and Halifax is big, prosperous, right? It depends on your perspective in terms of how we understand geography, marginality. Each one of these things is historically laden. And in terms of the historical research, and again, in terms of how these definitions get constructed, and in terms of the kind of evidentiary basis so that we know if we're failing or succeeding. And I think what's interesting from a historical perspective, and this is something that the speakers have alluded to, how many times we've done this already before. And so when you want to do something new, and I appreciate and understand the sincerity of the commissioners, but I think it's incumbent on us, I think there's a responsibility to look at other previous efforts in terms of experimentation, and in terms of these efforts to make this break, or as the word crisis, or whatever term you want to use, or change, getting back to Danny Graham's point, how we understand change and what even change could mean. I think the other point, the final point I'll make, and this is part of what historians learn every single day, it's the exercise of being a historian, between what we can control and what we can't control. And I think where I do get worried with this process is we conflate the two. A lot of these things have little or nothing to do with decisions made by Nova Scotians, and they're part of a broader historical pattern. Part of it is part of a process where different decisions could have resulted in different effects. But I think we always need to be aware of the boundaries between the two. And I think and that's where historical context and narrative can assist with us understanding where other places went through very similar sets of processes, and it's really nothing or very little that Nova Scotia could have done, versus other times where there could have been a path that could have been taken. So I guess I'm making a picture that historical analysis can help you understand the difference between the two. Thank you.
Can you remind me of your name? Sorry.
Emmy.
Emmy, got it. Other questions for Jerry or Karen? Okay, so I will.
Sorry, there's one over here.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry. Please.
I made presentations to the Ivany Commission, and I was advocating some of the things that I think Karen and Jerry were referring to. And one of the things that, it's great that we're having this postmortem, because it's very rare that we do get this detailed critique of public policy here. So I'm really thrilled to see everybody here looking seriously at it, and actually looking at it from all sides as opposed to one particular vantage point. When we look at the Ivany Commission, you'd be well advised to talk to the research director, Mark Austin, who has spoken quite regularly and often about his experiences as part of the commission and what he hoped for and what actually transpired. He also gave us a great quote called "Dip it and Ivany it means anything you want it to be. There were sections in the draft version of the report on the cooperative movement, the emergence of the anti-Ganesha movement, common good solutions, social enterprise, local enterprise sparked by community hub schools. They were all in a draft, but at the last minute, 30 pages, which was longer than the historical analysis, was cut out. Serious policy researchers now should be looking to recover that, and because a large part of what was going on was that statement, and Rick, you hit it right on the head, because it was what I confronted and what others confronted, was Ivany's statement that this is ONE Nova Scotia. It is not about rural development, period. That's a really profound statement, because that's the distinct impression you got when you were advocating local innovation, local initiatives outside Halifax, of any kind, cooperative or potentially profitable, other than, say, the showpiece ones in the Apple industry or the pin-up things that Ray did a good job promoting.
Rick, do you want to comment on that?
There is reference in the main policy development part of the report to the fact that there has been intensive experimentation with community economic development in the province, and that although there have been many successes and achievements, it hasn't replaced the kind of core sources of jobs and incomes that those community economic development initiatives were often set up to deal with. I worked all through the 1990s, for example, in communities that had lost single industry communities built around fish plants that turned, when the ground fish shut down, turned to community economic development. And you can look back 20 years later and say, are those communities viable? Are the populations there? Are the incomes there? Is the tax base there to sustain the services and so on? And it's not a pretty picture, right? In the historical section, there's also a reference to the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, you did see cooperatives and a whole lot of social movements being a part of the response to the deindustrialization crisis that preceded it. So I think those things are touched on, but the message, it ends up saying that we need a core economy that creates an environment in which a whole lot of diverse kinds of economic activities can thrive, and we're losing that.
I'm going to make a fine distinction between local community development.
I'm just going to pause. I'm going to ask you to pause for a sec, because I'm concerned that Jerry and Karen are leaving in just a couple minutes, so I just want to flag one other question before they exit. Okay, actually, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I'll just speak loudly.
No, actually, you're being broadcast to the entire planet,
Oh, okay.
so people all over the world want to know about ONE Nova Scotia, so you have to speak into that.
Hi. So my question is also for Karen. So there seems to be, we talk about the hegemony of certain economic discourses and the economics discipline in development and in development policy. How do we bridge the gap between the kind of critiques of that we see coming from sociologists and anthropologists about local economics? Because right now it seems in policy circles we're really committed to this kind of liberal internationalist view of economic development, where you increase exports, you attract investment, foreign direct investment. How do we bridge that gap within academia and then also within public policy? And how can we get public policy to reflect better the diversity of opinions on development, and how do we?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a perpetual question. From looking at it from my side of things in academia, we're always asking ourselves how we can influence public policy, how we can talk to policymakers and distill our ideas into, you know, sort of policy relevant pieces of information. And I know that on the other side, there's a desire to tap into academic research, but you know, inabilities of all kinds, whether it's, you know, our research is too obscure or opaque, or, you know, we just don't seem to be doing policy relevant things. But I think somewhere in the middle, there are a lot of people who are doing really important policy relevant research that does challenge orthodox ideas about how you develop an economy and, you know, how you govern people. So it's out there. It's just a matter of, I guess, engaging in dialogues like this, you know, and hopefully also getting critically minded people working in the public service. The challenge, though, is that having ideas that challenge the norm don't get you far. So I think it's just it's an age-old conundrum. I don't know.
Jerry, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just pick up on that thread and some of the threads of earlier conversations before I had to leave. And I guess it's some of the, and thank you for the questions. I mean, it's helping to kind of articulate and to distill some of these ideas. I guess one of the things, I guess, from a historical perspective, I would make, we need to question. And questioning doesn't mean resisting or denigrating or dismissing. It's just questioning. Because we talk about the necessary to have competition within the economy. Well, we need competition within politics, and we need competition within ideas. So if you have a report that talks about the need for entrepreneurship and competition, well, then we need to have competition about those ideas. And I guess I would question whether or not a crisis, even if it is a crisis, is going to necessarily need or have, and the best option is to have a huge, you know, existential choice and change, so that everything needs to change. I guess I would make a vote for caution. Our neighboring province gives us an excellent example of what happens when you have too much consensus, too much kind of redemptive optimism, a charismatic leadership, and the result is the unmitigated disaster of Muskrat Falls, which we don't know if it's going to be $15 or $20 billion. Right? So when I look at Nova Scotia, I'm thankful that we're cautious, right? So that, and there was a remarkable consensus. Danny Williams had the support of all of the parties. And so if we want to look at other models, the consensus model, look at where it got Newfoundland and Labrador, which rode the commodities bubble, which had all of the benefits that Nova Scotia didn't have, and now it's an economic basket case. So we have another example. It's our neighboring province. We don't even study them, right? They're a neighboring province. So I guess from my perspective as a historian, a little bit of caution as we move through the ONE Nova Scotia process, I think is in order. Otherwise, we could end up very clearly, once you go down the road of consensus, which is do not oppose, do not do as we do in our academic bubble, so to speak. I think that's important because I know where it can lead you. And $15 billion is an awful place to be.
I'm concerned, Jerry, that when you leave, half the group's going to leave with you, so you're going to have to stop there. Our panel is not over. We have lots of time remaining, but I do want to thank Karen Foster and Jerry Bannister for joining us today, and they will be joining us at a round table later, and I'll offer a token of our appreciation to them at that time. But join me in thanking the two scholars for joining us today. And next time we promise to have a joint lecture with Jerry Bannister's class, so he doesn't have to run out, and Karen's class too. Of course, Karen's also going to teach. So the lens focuses a little more tightly now on Rick Williams and Danny Graham. May I just ask my own question before we continue, which is politics and politicians, or say are politicians, omitted from the Ivany Report? That seemed to be a concern or objection that Karen and Jerry seemed to suggest, that there was not enough. Politics and politicians should have been more of a focus, and the problem of politics in the province. Danny, do you have a...
I knew you'd point to me first.
Yeah? You want...
It's really tricky ground for the commissioners to sort of, in the way that I think I heard, I think it was Jim who said, call it out, name it more concretely in terms of who's responsible for some of the challenges and the fixes. One of my concerns is that, as I mentioned in my remarks, was that the game changers aren't getting enough attention. And game changer number one was a new politics. I think from a practical perspective, that is the right positioning. What we haven't done in an open way is determine how will that, what are the potential measurements for whether that gets moved. Set aside what Karen's concerns were about the measuring attitude question. I think that's a really interesting concept, and how it got expressed in the report and how it's being expressed right now are actually worth a separate conversation. But I think that they positioned it well in saying that we fundamentally need to change the way that we do politics, and they provided some concrete suggestions. What hasn't happened is much real follow-ups around, so what does that necessarily mean? So I welcome any ideas for interventions in that regard.
I'm going to, unless you want to contribute to that, Rick, I'm going to draw on a couple student questions, if I may. Okay, Juliana Robertson.
Hi, I'm Juliana Robertson, MPA student. My question is for Danny Graham, actually. The Now or Never report summarized several key areas of growth needed in Nova Scotia, such as immigration retention, interprovincial migration, and entrepreneurship. For the purposes of my question, child care is an example of the broader issue of improving living standards in Nova Scotia. So I have a few examples here. So median child care fees in Halifax are approximately $800 per month. There are only enough regulated child care spaces for approximately 25% of children ages 0 to 5. Employment for single mothers is 72% as compared to 75.8% of mothers in a couple, as opposed to 83% of single fathers, and the average percentage of women ages 20 to 34 making minimum wage is approximately 20%. In Halifax, the percentage of a woman's income that is directed towards childcare is 28%. With this in mind, both in regards to key areas of focus as outlined in the report and the current landscape of childcare in Nova Scotia, where does childcare rank in the government's priorities? If we are trying to encourage growth through immigration, migration, and entrepreneurship, then shouldn't we also invest in social programs such as childcare? How can we expect for families to move to Nova Scotia if there are limited resources for them? How should the report and the government address these issues?
Thanks very much for the question, Juliana. And I think the question that you ask actually is integrally related to the focus that Engage is putting on the quality of life question. Engage is an independent organization that is funded by the government, and it's funded by institutions in the private sector and various others. We're in a sort of a middle space, if you will. So I can't speak for what the government's priorities are, but I can respond as a member of the ONE NS Coalition. When we looked at the Ivany Report and said, okay, there's the diagnosis, what's the prescription? The first thing that we actually attended to, and we put it as Chapter 1, was to go back to what we call the early years. And so 8 chapters in the Coalition Report. And as a long-standing public policy person before I got involved in politics and all these other different things, I was involved in justice reform types of issues, and restorative justice in particular. People used to ask me, is that the silver bullet, this restorative justice stuff? And my response is, there's no silver bullet, but to the extent that there is anything, it is it relates to the early years. And my focus is less on the workers, although that I think is an extension of this. Valuing people from prenatal to grade primary is economically, socially, environmentally, culturally, the single most important public policy issue that we should tackle, and it's why it was Chapter 1 in the second report.
Fanlin Ming. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Fanlin Meng, and I want to ask, the report asks for the shared view between rural and urban Nova Scotia. Could you elaborate how our public policy would build the consensus between rural and urban citizens? And in the report, it seems blaming rural citizens resisting changes. For example, it mentions that in some community, immigration are often stigmatizing as stealing local jobs. How could our developed strategy change their attitudes? And also, do you think that our developed strategy is a trolley truck problem that for the collective, great collective utility of us, that we need to sacrifice some groups in Nova Scotia.
And is that for one person in particular?
I'm bad with names, so.
Rick? No,
Yeah.
it looks like Rick. Want to take a stab at that one?
I'm not sure I got all of the question, but just picking up on the issue of rural attitudes towards immigration and so on. If you look in the back of the report, there is a report, a separate study done on attitude survey that was carried out by CRA that does identify and by region of the province and so on, where people are more or less receptive to bringing more immigrants into their communities, where there's more concern about whether immigrants take away jobs and so on. So that was something that was looked at very closely. And, I know, again, based on hearing Ray Ivany talk about the process he went through with all of the community meetings around the province that he had, this was an area of real concern for him, was that he felt that, I work a lot in the fishing industry now, right? There's, in the maritime provinces, there's around 40 fish plants that process lobster. In 2016, not a single one of those fish plants operated without temporary foreign workers. Given the demographic situation of the rural communities, the workers just aren't there anymore to do those kinds of seasonal jobs, and they're seasonal lower wage jobs, so they don't attract people to move back to those communities. So those industries, tourism, parts of tourism, agriculture and so on, have become dependent on temporary foreign workers. The real solution to that problem, what people, particularly in the federal government, are pushing for is let's get permanent immigrants. Let's not have temporary. Let's bring people in and give them who want to come to Canada and make them citizens. And that's where the issue of kind of receptivity in the communities becomes a barrier. I don't think it's an extreme barrier. But I think it's one that we'll have to work hard in our communities to overcome, because we need people to maintain those industries that are critical to our overall economy. We need people back into those communities, back into those workforces, and they're going to have to come from outside of those communities. They're not there now.
Rick, I'm gonna go back for another question. We've got two questions. I'd like to try to get both of them in because I know students have worked on them. Laura Beth McPherson, you're up.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Laura. I'm an MPA student. Thank you very much for being here today. I have a question around the evolution of the work that has been happening with economic development in this region. So the Ivany Report, and it's directed to Dr. Williams. The Ivany Report makes reference to the 1991 plan for Nova Scotia, and that there was a lack of a sense of urgency or awareness around the issue, say politically or at the local level as well. Do you think that the approach this coalition has taken moved the needle to solve that problem? Because we know that there's an economic challenge out there, but in 1991 there was a lack of awareness. So did the ONE Nova Scotia Coalition move the needle around solving that problem? Did you increase awareness? Is there more urgency around solving this issue? And has there been any action taken from government from a policy point of view? Just curious.
Well, I think Danny should comment, because he's been, through Engage Nova Scotia, he's been doing a lot more kind of consultations on and public discussions on this. The one thing I would say is that economic development was not an issue in the last election. The success or failures of the current government in the economic development field were not a critical didn't appear to be critical in how people voted a whole lot. In this discussion today, it's not apparent that people believe economic development is necessary or that it works. There's no consensus. There's no fundamental, I think to some extent, and I'll say this if I have a chance when later when Karen and Jerry are with us, but in some respects, who can have that kind of discussion? Who can debate about whether or not we need jobs and whether we need all these low-wage workers in this city, all the women who can't get out of the trap of poverty and low-wage jobs, and working poor people in this province. We haven't, I resist going into statistics, right? But compared to other provinces, we lose on almost every one of those measures. On average incomes, on proportion of the workforce that's working poor, on our health status issues, all of these things. Who can possibly say that we don't need more wealth in this province to provide more, critically needed human services, health care, education, et cetera? But there's no, in this room, in any meeting you go to, it's a debate about whether or not we need to grow the economy. And it's not a big political issue. It's not something that people are making up their minds about who to vote for, et cetera.
Danny, do you want to offer a thought on this? I'm going to ask Katie to tee up Paul for the last question.
Yeah, I'm going to go to the question, the part of the question about whether one might believe that there's increased awareness. I think that any of us would have a perspective on that. I actually fairly strongly believe that there is an increased awareness, and to Dr. Bannister's comment, there's an interesting question about whether we should have started with the questions of who are we and what are we after, kind of thing, something more foundational. And if we did, to what extent might that resonate with people? To what extent might people become impatient, or might it seem ethereal, as opposed to something that turned out to be more concrete, that nonetheless seems to be engaging the questions about, so where do we go now? And for those people who disagree, I think that the discussion is quite alive. So in my lifetime, the awareness about, and this feeds on, I think, a global phenomenon with Trump and various other sort of the recognition for everybody that we're hitting echo chambers and a fragmented world in the ways that we haven't. I think that the awareness locally, regionally, and globally has never been higher.
Paul.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm an MPA student. And my question is directed for Danny. In January 2017, the Chronicle Herald released an article stating that of 400 Nova Scotians surveyed, 48% had no opinion of the Ivany Report. 36% felt there was little to no progress in meeting the report's goals, and 17% believe the goals are working. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, and how is the Ivany Report actively working to, or the ONE Nova Scotia Coalition working towards persuading people that the Ivany Report is beneficial for Nova Scotia?
You know, one of the challenges with reports like this, like any report, is that it gets written with, and it gets released with great intentions and a lot of fervor, and in a short period of time it starts to collect dust. When I saw that data point, I actually imagined what the comparator would be for almost every other large report that we would have been doing as a province, the ones that date back to the 30s and the 50s and the 60s and that sort of thing. And I think you would have gotten that data point within a couple weeks, in a certain sense, from people before. The fact that, you know, there even was that level of awareness, I didn't see as a discouraging sign. And I think that there is work that is happening that flows, that this has a tail that is less visible and attached necessarily to the Ivany kind of stuff than other things. So I think we need to be realistic about all of the things that need to happen, and that a report is just a report. And as Dr. Bannister said, what moves people is the story more than the data. And the report is principally, while it has a narrative of some sort, it isn't grafted on sufficiently to stories. And so as that gets lifted up, I think that will actually begin to to move it more substantially, whether it's called Ivany or something else. I think change is afoot.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to just point out we ran a few minutes late today, of course, because we wanted to take a moment to reflect on the contribution of the Honourable Alan J. McEachen. Thank you so much for being part of our discussion, our event today. All four panelists will be heading down to the McEachen Institute, where they will join a roundtable discussion chaired by Daryl Dexter, and we'll discuss these issues further with some second-year graduate students, and I will present them with some gifts at that time on your behalf. So I want to say thank you so much for such an engaging discussion, no pun intended, Danny, an engaging discussion on some of these important issues that confront the province, especially at this particular moment in time with us reflecting on Alan J. McEachen. So join me in thanking the panelists and those who asked questions today. Thank you so much.